The Chesapeake Affair was an international diplomatic incident that occurred during the American Civil War. On December 7, 1863, Confederate sympathizers from Canada's maritime provinces captured the American steamer Chesapeake off the coast of Cape Cod. The expedition was planned and led by Vernon Guyon of Nova Scotia and John Clibborn Brain. George Wade of New Brunswick killed one of the American crew. The Confederacy had claimed its first fatal casualty in New England waters. The Confederate sympathizers had planned to recoal at St. John, New Brunswick and then head south to Wilmington, North Carolina. Instead, the captors experienced difficulties at St. John, which required them to move further north and recoal in Halifax, Nova Scotia. American forces violated British sovereignty by trying to arrest the captors in Nova Scotian waters, which further escalated the affair. Wade and others were able to escape through the assistance of prominent Nova Scotian and Confederate sympathizer William Johnston Alman. The Chesapeake Affair was one of the most sensational international incidents that occurred during the American Civil War. The incident briefly threatened to bring Great Britain into the war against the North. Historical context: the practice of slave-owning was outlawed in Nova Scotia by the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. When the war began, most Canadians were overtly sympathetic to the North. At the beginning of the American Civil War, approximately 20,000 Canadians, almost half of them Maritimers, went to fight, primarily for the North. There were also strong family ties across the border. As the war went on, relations between Britain and the North became strained for numerous reasons and sympathy turned toward the South. Britain declared itself neutral during the war, which led to increased trade that went through Halifax to both northern and southern ports. Nova Scotia's economy thrived throughout the war. This trade created strong ties between Halifax and merchants from both the north and south. In Halifax, the main commercial agent for the Confederacy was Benjamin Weir & Co., a company that flew the Confederate flag outside its office and accepted Confederate money. The informal headquarters for the Confederates was located at Waverly Hotel, 1266 Barrington Street. At the same time, Halifax became the leading supplier of coal and fish to the North. While trade with the South was flourishing, the North created a naval blockade to prevent supplies getting to the South. Hundreds of blockade runners would use the port of Halifax to ship their goods between Britain and the Confederate States. Much of the coal and other fuels used to run Confederate steamers went through Halifax. Further, Canadians became fearful of the power the North demonstrated in destroying the South and the possibility of wanting to annex Canada after the Southern defeat. Toronto, Montreal, St. Catharines and Halifax hosted a well-financed network of Confederate spies, escaped prisoners, and soldiers of fortune trying to influence government opinion in the war. The Confederates arranged various attacks on the South from Canada, such as the raid on St. Albans, Vermont. The plan to kill President Abraham Lincoln was made in the St. Laurent Hall Hotel in Montreal, Quebec. The Chesapeake Affair was a plan created in St. John, New Brunswick by Confederate sympathizers to capture an American ship, which would become a blockade runner for the South. Capture. Locke had arranged for Brain and 16 Confederate sympathizers from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to board the Chesapeake as normal passengers. While in New York, while en route to Maine, on the night of December 7, just off the coast of Cape Cod, Brain and the others commandeered the vessel. In the exchange of gunfire that transpired, the ship's second engineer was killed and 3 others wounded. After the seizing of the vessel, Locke took command of the vessel himself at Grand Manan Island. The crew was faced with the problem that neutrality regulations forbade the bringing of prizes into British waters. Locke still took the Chesapeake to St. John, New Brunswick as planned, but was unable to load coal for the voyage south. As a result, the steamer made its way to Nova Scotia. They stopped in at Shelburne and at Concrel Bank, Nova Scotia on the La Hava River, where they loaded some coal, and then spent 2 days and sold some of the stolen cargo for supplies. In the meantime, two Union warships, the fast-side Wheeler Ella and Annie, moving south from Halifax, and the Decatur, coming north from Shelburne, were closing in. The Chesapeake was nearly caught by the Ella and Annie on the La Havre River. Under the cover of night, the Chesapeake turned all lights out and slipped behind Spectacle Island and out the La Havre without being detected. The Chesapeake was again able to avoid capture at Lunenburg and made its way to Halifax. The vessel moved through Mahone Bay. At St. Margaret's Bay it let some crew leave the ship. By December 16, the ship arrived at Mud Cove Harbor at Sambro. Once there, Locke went to Halifax overland and arranged to have a schooner come to Sambro to load coal. While the Chesapeake was being loaded with coal, the Ella and Annie and the Decatur arrived. Arrest. Upon the arrival of the American warships, most of the crew of the Chesapeake fled. Lieutenant Nichols of the Ella and Annie violated British sovereignty and international laws and proceeded to arrest the 3 men that remained, 1 New Brunswicker and 2 Nova Scotians. George Wade, who had murdered a crew member, was among the prisoners. The Americans took the Chesapeake to Halifax to get clearance for their actions from the British. The Chesapeake arrived in Halifax on December 17, under the escort of the 2 American warships. 3 other warships, who had also been in pursuit of the Chesapeake, followed. U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward told the British that he wanted the Chesapeake returned immediately and the captives put in jail and extradited to the States. Escape. William Johnston Alman was generally regarded as the unofficial Confederate consul in Halifax. He constantly harbored Confederate refugees, and hosted numerous prominent Confederate officials, who were automatically welcomed at Rosebank during their stay in town. He was a friend and correspondent of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. He worked with Alexander Keith, Jr., to free the Confederates. The Chesapeake was to await adjudication in the Colonial Admiralty Court, while the Confederate prisoner Wade was to be given to the American authorities for extradition. Alman and Keith arranged for Wade's escape in a rowboat to Ketch Harbor and then on to Hantsport. The Americans were outraged and, in response, the British put a warrant out for the rest of his crew. A few of the crew were tried but were found not guilty on a technicality. Aftermath. While the Southern sympathizers believed they were engaging in an act of war because they had an official letter of marque from the Confederacy, as the investigation into the affair unfolded, it was discovered there was no legality to their letter. As a result, rather than the Chesapeake Affair being an official act of war, it was, in fact, an act of piracy and condemned as such by most of the newspapers in the Maritimes. Many Southerners settled in Canada after the war. In Halifax, approximately 30 senior naval and army officers from the South settled in the city. Some of the most prominent were John Wilkinson, Thomas Edgeworth Courtney, and John Taylor Wood.